Hey everyone! Today I'm going to talk to you about counterplan theory and competition. Counterplans are a staple of negative strategy in 2020, but they're also one of the most misunderstood areas of debate theory. Many people know how to debate counterplan competition, but only because they've memorized the key words and concepts that go behind those debates without really understanding why those concepts mean what they mean, where they came from, or why they're being invoked in this particular context. Memorizing terms like intrinsicness or severance will get you a decent portion of the way a lot of the time in these debates, but you're never going to make the best version of those arguments unless you fully understand their context and what those arguments mean. In this video, I'm going to dive a little bit into the logic behind counterplans, how those counterplans evolved over time, and how that evolution should shape the way that you debate counterplan theory and competition. First, what is a counterplan? Before I give my answer, I want you to think about it for a little bit and write down your own definition. Feel free to pause the video while you do this. So, what is a counterplan? Most people, when asked to define the term counterplan, will say something along these lines. You'll notice that these proposals share a couple of characteristics. A lot of them talk about advocacies and proposals. Some of them talk about some counterplan associated words like competing and solving. But all of these definitions are either slightly imprecise or they're altogether incorrect. So let's talk about why. In order to understand why, we need to figure out what the role of the neg is and how counterplans relate to that role. So what is the role of the neg? The role of the neg is to disprove the desirability of the plan. In past debate, we would have said resolution, but since we're doing plan-focused debate now, the neg's role has become to disprove the desirability of the plan. The plan is a normative statement. It says that an actor should do an action. The win condition of the affirmative team, which is to say the situation in which the affirmative wins, is the situation in which the statement that actor should do action is true. The implication of that is that the win condition of the negative team is that that statement is false, which means that actor should not do action. So how does the neg accomplish their win condition? There are two ways. The first way is by presenting defense, which responds to the AF team's reasons that actor should do action. The second way is by presenting offense, which advances reasons why actor should not do action. So recall the neg win condition, which is that actor should not do action. Given the similarity between our phrasing of our offensive definition and our phrasing of the neg win condition, it would seem to follow that any strategy that can enable the neg to satisfy its win condition on its own has to contain an offensive component. We'll set aside presumption for now, which complicates that story a little bit, but that's a whole other more complicated discussion. So, what kind of offense does a counterplan generate? The answer to that question is that a counterplan introduces an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is a benefit that a person could have received but gave up by taking a different course of action. In economics, the concept of opportunity costs helps us describe how a finite economy works in which there are trade-offs. Suppose that if someone has 6 units of fabric, they can turn it into 6 t-shirts, or they can turn it into 4 pairs of pants, not both. Here, if we make 6 t-shirts, an opportunity cost of that is making 4 pairs of pants. This does not mean that if we make t-shirts, we're destroying pairs of pants. Nor does it have to mean that we pay anyone in pants in order to produce t-shirts, as you might think might be the case just because the term says cost in it. Rather, what we're saying is that pants are an opportunity cost of shirts, which means that by making shirts, we are giving up the option to make pants instead, because we're using up our limited fabric on the shirts. A logical outgrowth of this concept in policy debates is that we should evaluate the opportunity costs of the actions that we take. So, as early as the 1950s, debate scholars began proposing the idea of a counterplan, which is an option that is foregone by doing the plan and which would have been better than the plan if we had taken that route. And so that's our basic definition of a counterplan. It's an option that is foregone by doing the plan, which would have been better than the plan if we had taken it. In other words, a counterplan is a way that we formulate opportunity costs into a statement of an alternative course of action or a path not taken if we choose to pursue the plan. But it's not enough to suggest that there are opportunity costs to doing the plan in order to win. Just like with any offensive argument, it's important to prove that there's a link, and it's important to prove that there's an impact that outweighs the advantages. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, the link. How do we tell that a counterplan is actually an opportunity cost of the plan? The way that we do this is through competition. There are two ways that a counterplan can compete, and either of these ways means that it's an opportunity cost of the plan. The first way is if you cannot do both, which means that the two are mutually exclusive. So some examples of that could be if the plan increases regulations, the counterplan might decrease regulations, or if the plan moves a set of troops to one place, moving that same set of troops to another place, or spending $1 million on one thing versus spending that same $1 million on something else. All of these are impossible to combine with each other, which means that they are opportunity costs of each other. Increasing regulations and decreasing regulations cannot both be done, which means that by increasing regulations, we're giving up the opportunity to decrease regulations. If the benefits of a mutually exclusive option outweigh the benefits of doing the plan, then the neg has satisfied their win condition, because they have proved that the federal government should not do the plan and should instead do the mutually exclusive counterplan. The second way that the counterplan can illustrate competition is through net benefits, which proves that you should not do both. Not that you cannot do both, but that you should not do both. So these are cases where it is legally, physically, fiscally possible to combine the two options, but it is better to do the counterplan alone than to do both the plan and the counterplan, or to do the plan. In other words, the best worlds are the ones in which the plan is not present. For example, if the federal government could fix a problem and the 50 states could fix that problem, but involving the federal government causes political fights that the states avoid, then including the federal government makes our policy net worse, making the states alone net better. In all of these examples, the counterplan is not just better than the plan, it is also a reason to reject the plan. It's important to remember that both of these components are necessary for a counterplan to prove that the neg should win. A mutually exclusive counterplan that is worse than the plan is not a reason to reject the plan, since the opportunity being foregone is worse than the advantage being claimed. Now, at this point, neg teams had an idea. They realized that they could take any non-competitive proposal and tack on a plank at the end that is mutually exclusive, for example, banning the plan. Or they could pursue a less obvious tack, for example, the world government counterplan. If the plan used the federal government, it would be mutually exclusive to abolish all national governments and replace them with a world government. So, problem solved for the neg. Now any counterplan can be competitive, right? Well, when the neg first arrived at this innovation in the late 70s and early 80s, the AF actually had pretty limited options to fight back. In an article from 1985, which was called Counterplan Competition, Permutations and Beyond, University of Kentucky coach Roger Solt explained that competition debates during this time were dominated by a variety of so-called competition standards, which were essentially these basic tests that people used to figure out if counterplans were competitive. Remember, permutations in that language were only just being introduced at this point, so permutations were being used to represent all of these different ideas that had been floating around for a while. And the way that competition debates would break down is the negative would introduce a counterplan, and they would throw out a bunch of these competition standards that the AF was then invited to challenge so that they could prove that the counterplan was not competitive. Some of these will look familiar to you, so you'll recognize mutual exclusivity and net benefits from before, but there are some other ones that are not so popular anymore that were pretty popular back then. For example, redundancy competitiveness, which says that the plan and the counterplan have the same advantage, which makes them logically redundant with each other, so there's no point in doing both. Philosophical competitiveness, which says the plan and counterplan are philosophically incompatible, and resource competitiveness, which says that there's not enough money or natural resources or human power, etc., to do both of the plan and the counterplan. So all of these have kind of fallen out of favor, but there are a variety of these competition standards floating around. But the problem is that none of these standards were really helping the AF think through this new neg innovation of adding pieces to counterplans in order to make them compete, or choosing counterplan options which, through their expansiveness, are impossible to combine with the plan, such as the world government counterplan. All of these competition standards kind of help us think about the counterplan as a whole. So we need a new conceptual tool to start thinking about the counterplan in pieces so that we can isolate those parts of the counterplan that compete from those parts that don't. So in response to this, Roger Salt introduced mechanical permutations. Mechanical permutations look at all combinations of the plans and counterplans components, and then determined if any of those components are better than the counterplan alone. And this is a logical consequence of our initial definition of competition, because if the entire plan is included in the best available option, even if that option also includes some other stuff that's like part of the counterplan, then the neg has failed their burden to prove that the USFG should not do the plan. This approach dealt pretty effectively with the first group of those new neg counterplans I talked about. So those counterplans that included a ban the plan plank, mechanical permutations got rid of those, because the mechanical permutation could sift through all the parts of the counterplan, identify the part that was mutually exclusive, throw it out, realizing that it's not relevant to that benefit, and then combine the rest of the counterplan with the plan to produce the best policy option. But the second kind of counterplan is much thornier. So what do we do about this problematic example like the world government counterplan, which says get rid of all national governments and in so doing ban the plan because the plan is done by a national government like the USFG? To solve this problem, Roger Salt introduced the idea of a logical permutation. A logical permutation doesn't just look at the counterplan as a sum of mechanical planks, like a mechanical permutation does. Instead, it looks at the counterplan critically and breaks it down further into smaller pieces and permutes only some of those smaller pieces. Let's take a look at how that helps us with the world government example. So imagine we have our proposal, which says that the federal government should fund police body cameras. The neg would then respond by saying that the United States federal government should dissolve and a world government should be created to replace it. Seems mutually exclusive. If we do our mechanical permutations, it seems like the counterplan is two parts. The federal government should dissolve and a world government should be created to replace it. And if we permute the plan and each of those individual two parts, we have some pretty bad options to choose from. The first permutation, to do the plan and dissolve the USFG, doesn't make any sense because the plan has the federal government act and also dissolves it. So that's clearly mutually exclusive. And the second part seems like it links to the net benefit, since the world government counterplan says that sovereignty and national governments are bad and says that we need to abolish those in order to make the world government be effective. The plan including the federal government, and therefore the perm keeping the entire United States federal government around, is pretty bad for the counterplan to solve its net benefit. It makes it way harder for us to solve the net benefit, and the counterplan still has a differentiable advantage over just the plan. So the logical perm helps us out of this double bind because it helps us think about the component parts of the counterplan. While the neg wants you to think of dissolving the USFG as one action, we can dig deeper and interrogate what that actually means and look into how, in fact, it's many, many different actions. It's dissolve this agency and that agency, cancel this program, cancel this project, that project. One of those projects is funding police body cameras. So the logical permutation lets us take the dissolve the USFG part into many different pieces and permute all those parts that are not mutually exclusive with funding police body cameras. While logical permutations were an innovation from this time period that caught on, a few other experiments were not quite as successful or helpful to evaluating counterplan competition. These are what we call today illegitimate permutations. So one such experiment is called the severance permutation. This strain of argument would combine only part of the plan text with all or part of the counterplan, thus severing the part of the plan that linked to the counterplan's net benefit. Take a second before I answer the question to think about why severance permutations do not disprove counterplan competition, and use the concepts that I've talked about so far to formulate the best reason for that you can think of. You should pause the video here and write down your best guess to try and apply some of the ideas that I talked about a little bit before. Did you write down something about fairness or neg ground? Well, that's a good answer if you did. It's not the best answer. Because remember, in order to win, the AF must show that the plan is included in the best option presented to the judge, while the neg must show that the best option does not include the plan. If a severance permutation, which doesn't include the whole plan, is the best option, it means that the neg should win, not the AF, since the best option doesn't include the whole plan. That's the actual best reasons why severance permutations don't disprove counterplan competition, but of course, there are theoretical objections to these as well, such as that the neg is entitled to link arguments about the plan from fairness considerations, because otherwise, the neg would not be able to have a consistent target against which to aim its offense. Another experiment from this time period is called the intrinsic permutation, or the intrinsicness permutation to be more precise. The idea of intrinsicness was ported over from a debate that had occurred largely in the late 70s about the criteria that should be used to evaluate links to disadvantages. In that context, the AF had argued that negative disadvantage links had to be intrinsic to the plan, which meant that they had to prove that every conceivable universe that includes the plan would also include the disadvantage link. The way that the affirmative would go about testing this is by advancing an additional proposal to the plan that could solve the link if it was adopted out alongside the plan. For example, in a politics disadvantage, this is the context in which intrinsicness arguments are the most familiar to us, where if the affirmative says that the federal government should do something, say fund police body cameras, and the negative says that that would trade off with something, say passing tax reform, the affirmative could argue that that's not an intrinsic disadvantage because you could imagine a world in which both tax reform and funding for police body cameras passed. So there was a bit of a debate about whether or not this is desirable, and at the culmination of this debate, this standard for link evaluation kind of ended up getting rejected overall, for a variety of reasons. It was argued that this standard enabled the AF to advance non-topical proposals, so whatever part they tacked on to solve the disadvantage would be totally outside the topic, and so it was unpredictable. It was argued that this kind of evaluation encouraged more shady behavior, since the AF team would frequently not describe the actions they were taking to solve the dishad in very much detail. And more importantly, neg teams argued that the term should in the resolution includes questions of political expediency. And so, for example, if police body cameras were going to result in a trade-off with passing tax reform, the hypothetical possibility that the two could be combined would not be a reason that the United States federal government should fund police body cameras. While the neg won the battle over whether disadvantage links had to be intrinsic, the AF made a new argument with respect to counterplans. This time, AF teams argued that if an opportunity cost can be avoided without foregoing the plan, that opportunity cost is not intrinsic and therefore not a reason to reject the plan. They did this using the intrinsicness permutation, which added proposals that neither the plan or the counterplan included in order to solve the net benefit. Affirmative teams tried to distinguish this move from the move they attempted with disadvantages, even though the logic behind the moves is basically identical, by explaining that when there's a counterplan, the negative team has already introduced the idea of using fiat to ignore questions of political expediency. And so once the floodgates are open, so to speak, the AF is then justified in tacking on additional proposals, no matter how politically utopian they are, to resolve the trade-off with the opportunity cost the neg is presented with their counterplan. Affirmative teams didn't end up winning this fight either, because all of the other problems with the intrinsicness standard remained the same. It was still equally arbitrary, unpredictable, and affirmative teams were equally sketchy by not really talking about the details of the extra proposals they were tacking on. And so intrinsic perms are generally treated today as illegitimate. To sum up, legitimate permutations have to include only all of the plan and all or part of the counterplan and nothing else. Permutations that don't include the whole plan are severance permutations, while permutations that include something other than the plan and counterplan are intrinsicness permutations. So now that we've talked about legitimate and illegitimate permutations in the context of counterplan functions, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up an additional standard of counterplan competition, which is called textual competition. So textual competition is a different method than functional competition of evaluating whether or not a counterplan is competitive, which is to say that we only evaluate whether the counterplan is legitimate by looking at the text of the plan and the counterplan. Under this approach, we would completely ignore the meaning of the words on the page or what those words do, and we would look at the letters on the page alone to determine if there is a match between words in the counterplan and words in the plan. So, this process, which is called textual competition, was invented in order to help affirmative teams answer process counterplans. And there are some advantages to this approach. The first one is that it's objective. So while there are many different ways that you can interpret what a function is, with a text, there's only one interpretation because you're literally just looking at what letters are on the page in front of you. A second advantage of this approach is that it can help limit out bad counterplans. So if we were worried about consult counterplans that just copy-pasted the entire plan text, or a pick that just did the entire plan and then said except for X at the end, textual competition helps us create a clear standard that we can use to limit out some of those counterplans in a principled way. And those counterplans are maybe desirable to limit out because if they're including the entire plan text, chances are that they're not disagreeing with very much of the plan. So let's look at some examples and evaluate them according to textual competition standards. So the first example is the federal government should end qualified immunity is the plan, and the counterplan is the United States federal government should end qualified immunity in every state except Alaska. And the 2AC stands up and says, permutation, do the counterplan. So think about this for a second. Has the affirmative successfully advanced a competition argument under the textual competition standard? Is this permutation, in other words, legitimate under textual competition standards? Or is it severance or intrinsic? Think about this for a second. So you would maybe think that because the counterplan includes the entire plan text, perm to the counterplan must be a successful permutation, right? Wrong. Under textual competition, this is not a legitimate permutation. It is textually intrinsic because neither the plan nor the counterplan includes the words do or counterplan, and it textually severs every word in the plan text other than the word the. So this is kind of helps underscore what I mean when I say that textual competition literally does not care about the words or about the meaning of the words in the plan text. So obviously, if we're looking at the words perm to the counterplan, we know what that means, and what that means is it's footnoting the counterplan text into existence in that slot. But under textual competition, none of that matters because textual competition literally does not look at the meaning of the words at all. And all it looks at is, do the letters match up to the plan and counterplan text? And in this case, no, it does not match up. A legitimate version of this permutation would be permutation, the United States federal government should end qualified immunity in every state except Alaska. So in that world, we have included all of the words in the counterplan, and we have included all of the words in the plan since the plan text is included within the counterplan text. And that permutation, we're in the clear. But just saying perm to the counterplan is illegitimate. The second example. The plan is the federal government should fund police training programs in the United States. The counterplan is the United States federal government should fund, or rather, the United States federal government ought to fund police training programs. And it doesn't include the phrase in the United States, and so the neg could argue that this solves better because it funds police training programs globally. It solves global police brutality. Say that the affirmative makes the following permutation. The United States federal government ought fund police training programs. So this is theoretically the smart version of the permutation from the earlier example. So they've actually spelled out the counterplan text this time. Are they in the clear? What do we think? Under textual competition, even this is not in the clear. It textually severs since it doesn't include the words in and should, and it only includes the words the United States once rather than twice as in the original plan text. And so the second thing is arguably not a reason why the counterplan severs, or why the permutation severs rather, but it definitely severs the words in and should, which are in the plan text, because it replaces should with ought, and the word in is just nowhere to be found. So, how could we craft a persuasive and legitimate permutation? Well, one way that textual competition allows us to craft permutations is to play Scrabble. So basically, all we have to do is arrive at the meaning of the counterplan by rearranging words in the plan. So here, we have to get rid of the words in the United States as a modifier for police training programs somehow, because police training programs, we have to arrive at funding those globally. So my proposal is the following permutation. The United States federal government in the United States should fund police training programs. Now, this permutation changes the modifier that is affected by the phrase in the United States. We're now talking about the federal government in the United States rather than police training programs in the United States. But it's textual competition, so it doesn't matter because the meaning of the words is completely irrelevant. All that matters is that we've kept all of the same words and language that is in the plan text to avoid severing any of those words. So that version of the permutation would be legitimate. It includes all of the words in the plan, and it includes no other words. Let's look at a last example before I wrap this section up. The United States federal government should increase its development of offshore oil reserves. The counterplan says the United States federal government should increase its use of offshore oil reserves instead of saying development, and the net benefit is a critique of the word development, and saying development is colonialist. So, the AF would advance a permutation. The United States federal government should increase its use of offshore oil reserves. So, this example should be easy by now. Under textual competition, that permutation is not legitimate because it does not include the word development, which is in the plan text. So, having gone through this exercise, we have exposed some clear issues with textual competition, since evaluating textual competition completely ignores the meaning of words. It creates some pretty nonsensical results, right? We're excluding some pretty reasonable seeming words, right? We've got this clearly competitive word pick, and we don't particularly like word picks. Here's another funny example. If you imagine the plan text, but just put the words, the United States federal government should not, and then do the plan text, or should ban doing the plan text, all of those counterplans would not be textually competitive because they include all the words in the plan, even though they're the exact opposite of what the plan text does. So we're getting some pretty ridiculous results by completely ignoring the meaning of words. And so some people have proposed remedying this by combining textual and functional competition. So arguably, that fixes some of these problems. It keeps the benefits of textual competition, since counterplans that include the entire text of the plan would not be textually competitive. They would only be functionally competitive, right? And by saying that counterplans have to be competitive in what they do, we're avoiding the problems of completely ignoring the meaning of words. Now, I would argue that this still doesn't resolve all of the problems, since the intrinsic problems with textual competition import a lot of issues into this new combined standard. So, for example, a counterplan that banned the plan would still not compete under this interpretation, since the counterplan has to compete both textually and functionally, and that counterplan does not compete textually, right? It does screen out things like word picks, since word picks don't compete functionally, but we're still keeping a lot of the old problems that we had around. And it's also unclear exactly how we're supposed to evaluate permutations, given this blend of standards. So, to wrap this up, that's all I wanted to say introducing counterplans. And so, on the accompanying worksheet, I've written down a few questions for you to think about before a lab, and you don't have to write anything down with respect to this, or you don't have to fill any of this out. We're not going to collect it or anything, but I would recommend thinking through these questions using kind of the conceptual tools that I've talked about here, and that will help you apply and internalize what I've talked about, and hopefully understand it a little bit more thoroughly. I will see you in lab, where we will debrief these concepts more fully. Thanks for watching.